Hi everyone, happy Friday and welcome to the ASF Science Roundup. I'm excited to tell you about 3 new studies today. They all come from different areas of the autism research arena, so hopefully there'll be something of interest for everyone out there. The first study I'll mention isn't brand new, but it does replicate previous findings in what's been a controversial area, the role of the environment in autism. So far, over a half a dozen papers have been published that look at air pollution and autism risk. They've all shown a slight but significant increase in risk after exposure to high levels of air pollution during certain periods in pregnancy. Most of these have been conducted on data sets in California. One of them was done in Taiwan. This new one is important because it looked at a different data set, one in North Carolina. They saw an increased risk of autism in individuals exposed to high levels of what's called PM10. PM10 is short for particulate matter 10, and it's air pollution made up of tiny particles, not any one specific chemical. Exposure to high levels of air pollution in pregnancy has been linked to many different developmental outcomes. These include changes in IQ, social problems, and aggressive behavior. Given the overlap in genetic signals between autism, anxiety, ADHD, and other psychiatric disorders, it doesn't really surprise me that environmental exposures may also produce similar outcomes. The current thinking is that, like genetic overlap, these environmental factors affect mechanisms and circuits involved in brain development, synapse formation, and cell-to-cell signaling. Clearly, more work needs to be done in understanding how genes and the environment interact, not only to lead to autism, but also different types of autism. The most common question I get when talking about air pollution and autism is, okay, what can I personally do to minimize exposure to air pollution? The reality is that air pollution is a huge issue, not only in the US, but in the entire world. The good news is that the Clean Air Act has improved air quality over the past 2 decades. There's a huge amount of information that we do not know, and more work needs to be done. But as a society, air pollution is something that we can all work together to change. So, that's my plug for being environmentally friendly and always taking care of our planet. Reduce, reuse, recycle. And now to the other side. And I really wish there weren't sides on this, but in some places there still are. I want to talk about genetic influences on autism. This week, there were a few interesting papers that came out that looked at de novo mutations using the Simon Simplex collection as a data set. De novo means new. These are mutations that aren't seen in the mother or the father. This Simon Simplex collection is interesting because it's a group of families that have one child affected by autism and another child who is not affected, not even mildly. They also looked at another group where there's only one child in the family and that child has autism. They're called trios. So in the study I want to talk about, the investigators looked at these de novo, again new, not seen in any parent. They looked at de novo deletions and insertions of information into the genetic code. They actually identified a new type of mutation seen in autism called a frame shift. They also identified 2 new autism candidate genes and confirmed others. What's really even more interesting in this that they found that girls had more of these different types of genetic markers than boys did. And the research estimate that this type of genetic mutation is a risk factor in about 7% of individuals affected with autism. Also of interest, while the mutations were new to the individual with autism, they could actually be traced back to one of the parents. So one of the parents probably had a mutation that contributed to the de novo mutation, even though the mutation in the child with autism was new. And it could be tracked back to the father. So the million-dollar question is, what's causing these de novo mutations to begin with? And just like I said after the last study, more research needs to be done. Finally, in the last study, I want to kind of point out a new project out of the Cleveland Clinic that addresses the never-ending quest for identifying specific genes and linking them to specific behaviors or changes in behavior. This study looked at a thorough investigation of individuals with a mutation in a gene called P10. P10 is actually a cancer gene that's been tied to autism risk in a couple of studies. Many people with ASD and a P10 mutation show larger head size, or what's called macrocephaly. This research group conducted a number of assessments on both men and women diagnosed with autism, some of which had the PTEN mutation and others who did not have a PTEN mutation. So they compared the two groups. The goal was to understand how this particular mutation contributed to ASD symptoms and also to behavior to determine whether or not genetic counseling or a specific genetic mutation would then be able to lead to specific therapies. So they did a number of different cognitive tests. They looked at behavioral assays, and they measured the brain on the whole, and then also looked at different brain regions. What they found is that people with autism who had the PTEN mutation had bigger heads and changes in a type of brain cell called white matter. They also showed generally impaired cognition and adaptive function. This included a slower processing speed with large deficits in working memory. This implies that behavioral treatment of individuals with the PTEN mutation should focus on slow, repeated presentation of information to maximize learning. The authors also suggest that these particular clinical features may signal the treating clinician that PTEN could be an underlying cause and actually may trigger genetic testing and counseling for the PTEN cancer-related risk. So going back, it works both ways. So individuals with the PTEN mutation may have, in fact, a more specific behavioral intervention paradigm, and those with this particular behavioral deficit may actually need to be screened for a PTEN mutation. So that's the end of my science roundup from different research studies this week, but I did want to mention a couple of things going on at the Autism Science Foundation. This week, several of our staff attended a great event sponsored by the Child Mind Institute. It's called On the Shoulders of Giants. It's a symposium that honors a senior scientist and his or her mentees. This year, renowned neuroscientist Pascal Rakish of Yale was the honoree, along with two of his mentees, Nanad Sistan of Yale and Matt Stade of UCSF. Matt serves as the chair of ASF's Scientific Advisory Board, so extra congratulations to Matt. Also, ASF's president, Allison Singer, spent a bunch of time this week working with the Inside Edition Undercover Unit to expose some of the so-called businesses that peddle non-evidence-based autism interventions and try to take advantage of our families. The piece will run in November, but we'll be sure to let you know when to turn in. It should be really interesting. And next week, I'll be down in Washington at the NIMH National Alliance for Research Progress meeting. The Alliance is a group of scientists and advocates whose diseases and disorders are researched through the NIMH. We'll be looking at the latest science and talking about best practices for treatment across the full range of mental health issues. As I keep mentioning, there's a huge amount of overlap with autism, anxiety disorders, ADHD, and other pediatric issues. So look for my live tweets and Facebook posts from the meeting. Thank you all for listening into this week's podcast. I'll leave you a little tidbit of something that I'm going to talk about next Friday. I'll report back on a new study that is aimed to improve the specificity of ASD diagnoses in toddlers. Have a great week and talk to you soon. Bye for now, Alycia.